The house was worth $4,820,000 when my husband asked me to sign the page that said I had never earned a claim to it. The number sat near the top of a refinance summary from Alder Private Bank. Appraised value, $4,820,000. Cash out amount requested, $1,200,000. Primary residence, Briarwood House. Borrower, Sebastian Whitmore. Non-borrowing spouse acknowledgement, Eleanor Shaw Whitmore. 3 pages later, tucked between tax disclosures and escrow instructions, I found the line that mattered more than the appraisal. By signing below, spouse acknowledges that she has no ownership, reimbursement, equitable, beneficial, marital, or possessory claim against the property located at Briarwood House, whether arising from payment history, improvement contributions, occupancy, or otherwise. It was written in the neutral, polished language wealthy people use when they want the permanent removal of another person to sound like routine administration. Sebastian had flagged the signature tabs with pale blue stickers. He had placed a Mont Blanc pen on top of the stack. He had also told me, in the same calm voice he used with waiters and trustees and reporters, that the rate lock expired the next morning and any delay would cost us an extraordinary amount of money. I read the paragraph twice, then flipped back to the appraisal summary. "You want to pull out $1.2 million, I said. Sebastian leaned against the study fireplace with one hand in his pocket and the other hand resting on the old oak mantel. He was wearing a navy double-breasted suit because he had come from a board dinner at the family foundation. The gold signet ring on his right hand caught the lamplight every time he moved. "It is not about wanting cash," he said. "It is about restructuring the debt while rates are still usable. And this page says I have no claim of any kind. It is a standard spouse acknowledgement." "No," I said. "It is a standard spouse acknowledgement plus a full burial." He smiled the way he did when he wanted me to feel elegant for noticing something he hoped I would ignore. "You are reading too aggressively." I set the packet down on the desk in Briarwood's archive room and looked at him. We had been married for 7 years by then. I already knew the danger of that sentence. In our marriage, reading too aggressively meant reading past the headline and into the mechanism. It meant noticing that something presented as inevitable had actually been designed. "I'm not signing tonight," I said. His expression did not crack, but it sharpened. "Eleanor, the property was mine before we married. Then why does the bank need me?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room, picked up the packet, and tapped the signature tab with one finger. "Because lenders prefer clean paper. That is all. Clean paper." That was how he described the removal of another person's future. "My name is Eleanor Shaw Whitmore." I was 36 years old when Sebastian handed me the refinance packet, and by then I had spent 7 years living inside a family that believed property was not just something you owned. It was something that proved who counted. Sebastian came from old money, which is different from new money in the way old walls differ from modern glass. New money wants to be seen. Old money wants to become part of the landscape so completely that people stop asking who built it. The Whitmores owned hotels, timberland, old apartment buildings in cities where nobody ever sold, and a family trust that seemed to have no beginning and no natural end. Sebastian's grandfather had created layers of ownership the way other men planted hedges. By the time I met Sebastian, the family's preferred moral argument was that wealth lasted only when emotion was kept away from structure. Sebastian's preferred version of that argument was simpler. "You married me," he once told me over lunch with his mother, Vivian. "You did not marry the trust." He said it as a joke the first time. Vivian laughed. I laughed too, because I was still new enough to believe that a family could talk like that and still have a warm center beneath the phrasing. What I eventually learned was that old money humor often functions as preloaded testimony. They say the cruel thing early, with a smile, so that later, when they repeat it seriously, they can claim you have always known the terms. I did not meet Sebastian because I was trying to marry a family system. I met him because I was good at something he needed and because he liked women who could make complicated things look manageable. My background was historic restoration and project administration. I spent my late 20s working for a preservation firm that handled major residential rehabs for clients who loved history but rarely understood what history cost. I knew how to read contractor bids, compare change orders to original scope, trace why a budget had moved, and document a wall opening or drainage failure so thoroughly that no one could later pretend the money had vanished into air. I was not an architect and I was not a lawyer. I was the person who kept ambitious people from lying to themselves about what a project would require. Sebastian loved that about me. He had inherited Briarwood House 2 years before we met, though inherited, in the Whitmore universe always meant something more decorative than simple death and distribution. The property had technically moved through a trust affiliate and then into Sebastian's personal name under a purchase arrangement tied to a family tax plan. What mattered in ordinary language was this: Briarwood House was the grand old residence near the edge of the Whitmore estate lands, and Sebastian treated it as both sanctuary and proof. It was a stone house with slate roofs, ivy that had to be cut back twice a year, original leaded windows that leaked winter air, a library built before central air existed, and a long gravel drive that made arrivals feel ceremonial even when you were only bringing home groceries. It was also, from the day I moved in, the center of a constant contradiction. Emotionally, it was supposed to be our home. Legally, it was always supposed to remain his. Before we married, Sebastian insisted on a prenuptial agreement. I did not object. At that point, Briarwood had been his property for years, and I was not interested in pretending that fairness required identical starting positions. I hired my own attorney. We negotiated language on debt, separate property, inheritances, personal earnings, and one section Sebastian's family lawyer repeatedly described as housekeeping, which turned out to be the section that would later decide everything. The house section began simply enough. Briarwood House and its base premarital value would remain Sebastian's separate property. Passive appreciation, absent other agreement, would presumptively remain his. My attorney, Lisa Merrick, pushed back on one point. She said that if I was going to live in a historic property that would require ongoing capital work, and if Sebastian did not intend to add me to title within a reasonable period, then the agreement needed a contribution schedule for marital principal reduction and permanent improvements paid from my earnings or from marital accounts. Vivian called that insulting. Sebastian called it unnecessary. Lisa called it basic. What we finally signed included an attachment called Schedule C. It was not romantic language. It did not promise me half the house. It did not convert premarital property into marital property. What it did was establish a reimbursement and equitable credit framework if my funds or jointly earned marital funds were used to reduce principal, finance qualified capital improvements, or underwrite a refinance that increased the property's value or borrowing capacity while I remained off title. I remember that page because Sebastian was annoyed by it. He signed the agreement with an expensive silver pen in Lisa's office, then said, "This will never matter." Lisa replied, "The clauses everyone says will never matter are usually the only ones that survive a marriage." At the time, I thought she was being cynical. Now I think she was simply experienced. When we married, Briarwood was beautiful and financially inefficient. Sebastian had inherited style with it, not maintenance discipline. The house needed drainage correction along the west stone wall, 2 sections of failing slate, a kitchen overhaul that dealt with structural sagging under the original flooring, a major HVAC replacement, and eventually a retaining wall repair after a season of hard rain destabilized the lower garden path. Sebastian's income was large but volatile. He received trust distributions, management fees, board retainers, and occasional special payments from a family development entity. All of that looked wealthy from a distance and irregular up close. My income was smaller, but it arrived predictably. I joined a boutique restoration and development group after our wedding and eventually became a senior project manager. My salary, my annual performance bonuses, and the fact that I documented everything made me useful to Briarwood in ways Sebastian liked more than he admitted. At first it was little things. I reorganized vendor files. I corrected duplicate insurance billing. I renegotiated maintenance contracts that had been drifting for years because no one in the family office cared enough to open the old folders and compare them. Then it became larger things, because houses teach people what they are willing to spend. The roof section over the north bedrooms failed first. Not catastrophically, but enough to stain plaster and require immediate work if we wanted to avoid structural rot. The estimate was $68,000. Sebastian was between distributions that quarter. I paid the deposit and the first 2 draws from my own savings because he said it would be cleaner to settle later. Later never came. Then the kitchen floor had to be opened because a contractor discovered water damage around the old plumbing runs and a joist issue beneath the limestone island. That project expanded from cosmetic improvement into structural repair, custom cabinet reconstruction, and underfloor reinforcement. Total cost, $194,000. I contributed $82,000 from a bonus and the rest flowed through the joint account, which was funded mostly by my salary that year because Sebastian had deferred a distribution during a family dispute over a timberland sale. Again, he promised we would true up everything. Then came the drainage and stone wall repair after a brutal spring runoff. $41,000. I paid the engineering survey. The house account covered labor and installments, and those installments were again stabilized by my payroll deposits. Then came HVAC replacement. Then window restoration. Then the smaller but relentless things that do not feel like drama when they happen and somehow become invisible once the result looks normal. Every time I raised title, Sebastian would kiss my forehead and tell me not to cheapen our marriage by making it sound like a transaction. Every time I raised Schedule C, he would say, "We signed that because your lawyer wanted to feel useful." Every time Vivian heard us circling the issue, she would say some version of, "A wife who feels secure does not need her name on every stone." So I compromised in ways women are taught to call maturity. I kept my invoices. I kept my contractor correspondence. I kept the permit approvals because I was the one who met inspectors and coordinated site visits. I kept the electrical and plumbing sign-offs, the engineer's stamped drainage note, the kitchen revision orders, the ledger of each wire I sent when a project could not wait. I did not keep those records because I was preparing for war. I kept them because project managers keep records the way other people breathe. By the 5th year of our marriage, the traceable amount I had personally put into Briarwood, either directly or through clearly documentable marital funding streams anchored by my income, had become too large to think of as decorative generosity. When I totaled it once out of curiosity, I stopped at $400,000 and closed the spreadsheet. I did not want to know the final number because naming it would have forced an argument I still hoped to avoid. Sebastian's great talent was making postponement feel civilized. If I said, "We should update title after the kitchen project," he said, "once tax season passes." If I said, "We should paper the reimbursement entries we discussed," he said, "after the audit committee clears the estate restructuring." If I said, "I'd like Lisa to review whether Schedule C should be implemented now that we are this far in," he said, "Why bring in adversarial language when nothing is wrong?" Nothing is wrong is one of the most dangerous sentences in a financially unequal marriage. It usually means everything important has already been arranged in someone else's favor. The first time I understood how deliberately Sebastian used my usefulness happened during our first refinance. Rates had dropped that year, and the family's longtime banker suggested replacing Briarwood's old loan with a new structure that would lower payments and free capacity elsewhere. Sebastian presented it as a smart housekeeping move. Then the underwriting notes arrived, and I realized the file leaned heavily on my income stability, my debt profile, and the fact that our household expenses showed a stronger pattern when my salary was included in the analysis. I was not added to title. I was not made a borrower in the sense ordinary people understand it. But I was used. My income verification was collected. My employment confirmation was collected. My financial statement was referenced. The email from Sebastian to the banker that I eventually found years later said it without embarrassment: "We need Eleanor's earnings in the file to make the coverage ratios work cleanly against the house expenses." At the time, when I asked why I was needed if the house was supposedly only his, Sebastian said, "This is normal. It does not mean ownership. It means underwriting like stable households." I asked whether that changed anything under Schedule C. He laughed softly and said, "You really did listen to Lisa." The refinance closed. The interest rate improved. Sebastian thanked me by taking me to dinner in the city and talking all evening about a future European trip we never took. He also told me, with that same polished sincerity, that once the next trust review ended we would clean up the title optics, so I stopped worrying. That was 4 years before he handed me the packet from Alder Private Bank. By then Briarwood had appreciated dramatically. The bank's appraisal estimated the value at $4,820,000. Sebastian wanted to pull out $1.2 million in cash, pay down a private line tied to a family investment, and reserve the rest for an opportunity involving a boutique hotel acquisition in Charleston. He did not tell me all of that at once, because Sebastian believed information should be given in the order most likely to secure agreement. First, he said the refinance would lower our effective cost of capital. Then he said it would give us flexibility. Then, after I asked what required flexibility, he said he wanted optional liquidity for a time-sensitive hospitality position. Only after I kept reading did he admit that part of the bank's concern involved clarifying any possible spousal claim before funds were released. The ugly beauty of documents is that they do not care about a marriage's preferred mythology. The bank did not care that Sebastian called Briarwood his family house. The bank cared that I had lived there for 7 years, that I had demonstrably contributed to its maintenance and probably to its increased debt capacity, and that a dispute could complicate enforcement later. So the bank wanted a page that would clean me off the file. Sebastian wanted me to feel sophisticated for cooperating. The lender is not accusing anyone of anything, he said after I told him I was taking the packet to bed to read. They simply want certainty. Certainty for whom? For the transaction. And for you. He did not argue with that. Instead, he sat beside me on the edge of the bed, loosened his tie, and put a hand on my knee. Eleanor, this house was protected before you came into my life. You know that. You also know I have never treated you like a guest here. That was his favorite kind of defense, the one that replaced legal structure with manners. As if being permitted to choose paint colors or host dinners outweighed 7 years of documented contribution. Then why does the form mention reimbursement claims based on improvement contributions? I asked. He exhaled through his nose. Because lawyers are diseased. That clause did not come from nowhere. Somebody at the bank saw a reason to include it. Banks overpaper everything. Did you show them the prenup? He paused. A small pause, but enough. Counsel provided the relevant pages. The relevant pages. I asked to see the prenup copy in the refinance file. He said it was with counsel. I asked which counsel. He said Charles Fenwick, the family attorney. I asked Charles to send me the exact copy he had furnished to the bank. Sebastian's tone chilled instantly. Why are you escalating a household matter through Charles? Because you just told me Charles is already in it. He stood, straightened his shirt cuffs, and said, "Do not turn this into a performance. Review the packet. Sign it tomorrow morning. We can discuss your discomfort after the closing." That sentence gave the game away. After the closing. After I no longer had leverage. So I did what I always do when someone wants me to react emotionally before I can organize the facts. I got quiet. I took photographs of nothing. I forwarded nothing. I opened old folders and started building a timeline. The next morning, Charles Fenwick's office emailed me a PDF of the prenuptial agreement. 17 pages, including signature pages. I stared at the footer. 17 pages. That was wrong. Not, maybe wrong. Not, I might be remembering wrong because the wedding week was busy. Wrong. I remembered the agreement as 18 pages because Lisa had joked about the attachment count when we signed. If they ever pretend this house schedule was not part of the deal, she said, tapping the back page, I want you to remember that the ugly little Schedule C is the reason page 18 exists. I still had our wedding binder in storage. Not because I am sentimental about calligraphy samples and invitation drafts, but because project managers do not throw away executed documents. I drove to the storage unit myself and opened the archival box in the parking lot. Inside was my signed copy of the prenup. 18 pages. Page 18 was Schedule C. I read it sitting in the front seat of my car while trucks moved around me and someone nearby argued over a loading dock receipt. The language was not miraculous. It did not hand me ownership. But it was precise. If my separate earnings or marital funds materially reduced principal, funded permanent capital improvements, or supported a refinance increasing the property's value or available equity while I remained off title, those amounts were to be recorded and either reimbursed or credited through a defined equitable formula upon sale, refinance proceeds, divorce, or other formal property event. It also required the parties to maintain reasonable records of such contributions. Reasonable records. I almost laughed in that parking lot. I had enough records to wallpaper Briarwood's guest wing. What I did not yet know was whether Sebastian had forgotten the page existed, decided it no longer mattered, or deliberately omitted it from the version Charles sent to the lender. All three possibilities were bad. Only one of them was strategic. My instincts told me to assume strategy. I made a scanned copy of my executed agreement at a copy shop, emailed it to myself and to Lisa Merrick, then drove back to Briarwood and said nothing. Sebastian was in the breakfast room with Vivian when I came in. Vivian was one of those women whose posture looked hereditary. She poured coffee without looking at the cup and had spent decades perfecting the tone of someone who can make disapproval sound like concern. "Charles says you requested the agreement," she said, as if it were a breach of etiquette. "I wanted to review what I signed." "Surely you remember your own prenuptial agreement." "I remember enough to know the bank copy is missing a page." Silence. Sebastian set down his cup. Vivian did not. "What page?" he asked. "Schedule C." He looked genuinely annoyed then, but not surprised. That distinction mattered. Vivian finally lifted her eyes to me. "That attachment was negotiated as a symbolic comfort item," she said. "It was never intended to convert Sebastian's house into communal property." I didn't say it did. "Then why this drama?" "Because the refinance waiver says I'm abandoning reimbursement and equitable claims tied to improvement contributions, and the page missing from the bank copy is the only page that addresses exactly those issues." Vivian smiled the way people smile when they think logic itself is vulgar. A properly loved wife does not inventory plaster and pipes. I looked at Sebastian instead of her. "Did you leave that page out on purpose?" He answered too smoothly. "Charles likely sent the operative pages. The page governing my contributions is operative. Only if we are having a hostile conversation. You gave a bank a form saying I have no claim from payment history, improvements, or occupancy. That is already a hostile conversation." He stood then, not angry in the theatrical sense but controlled in the way that means an internal decision has been made. "We are not doing this at breakfast." I said, "Then when?" He said, "After you calm down." That afternoon I received a second email, this time from Charles himself. He said the language in Schedule C was conceptual, that the parties had never operationalized any separate contribution ledger, and that the refinance documents merely clarified what had always been understood: Briarwood remained Sebastian's separate property. He also suggested, in a paragraph so slick it almost deserved applause, that the various funds I had spent over the years were best viewed as ordinary marital living support or elective household improvements consistent with the lifestyle of the residents. Elective. He described drainage correction, structural kitchen repair, roof replacement, and HVAC installation as if I had blown money on decorative lanterns for a garden party. I pulled my spreadsheets. I pulled invoices. I pulled bank statements. I spent 3 hours tracing every direct outflow I could support without inference. Roof deposit. Roof draws. Kitchen structural payment. Stone wall engineer. Drainage contractor. HVAC deposit. HVAC final. Window restoration. Permit fees. Materials reimbursements. Payroll transfers into the joint account in months when major principal reductions or large repair draws hit. The amount that met my own strict documentation threshold was $486,240. That number did not include groceries, furniture, linens, flowers, dinner parties, staff gifts, or any of the soft labor of making a grand house habitable. It was the hard spine only. I printed the spreadsheet and left it on my desk. At 6, Sebastian texted me that his mother expected us for dinner at the main house. I knew immediately what that meant. When old money families want to turn a financial disagreement into a moral trial, they move it to a table set with inherited silver. Vivian hosted in the formal dining room even when there were only 5 people. Sebastian's sister, Louisa, was there, along with Charles Fenwick. I took my seat across from Sebastian and realized before the first course that this was not dinner. It was witness preparation. Vivian began with civility. Charles moved to reassurance. Louisa supplied outrage on cue. By the soup course, my refusal to sign had been reframed as an attack on a multigenerational family asset. By the fish course, Charles was explaining that my expenditures, while no doubt generous, could not reasonably alter title. By dessert, Louisa was asking whether I had married into the family with a secret plan to litigate a house I had not brought into the marriage. The cruel efficiency of wealthy families is that they rarely invent facts when insinuation will do more damage. I waited until Charles had finished a little speech about informal household support before I asked a single question. If my role was purely informal, I said, why did the first refinance file require my income, my financial disclosures, and my signature? Charles replied without blinking. Many lenders prefer broad household clarity. And why does the new waiver specifically mention improvement contributions and reimbursement claims? Out of caution. Caution about what? No one answered that directly. Sebastian finally said, about preventing confusion. No, I said. About preventing leverage. Vivian set down her spoon with soft irritation. This is exactly what happens when practical kindness is reinterpreted by people who do not understand old families. We opened our home to you. I looked at her. I paid to keep your family's roof from collapsing. The room went still. It was the first impolite sentence I had spoken all evening, and that alone made me guilty in their eyes. After dinner, Sebastian followed me into the gravel court between the two houses. The outdoor lights gave everything a staged, amber beauty that had nothing to do with what it cost to maintain. You embarrassed my mother, he said. Your mother invited an audience. You are blowing paperwork into betrayal. You left the only page protecting my contributions out of the bank file. He stepped closer. Because the page is meaningless unless you decide to make our marriage adversarial. I said, you already made it adversarial when you asked me to sign away claims that your own lender thought were plausible. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, sign by noon tomorrow or I will inform the bank that you are intentionally interfering with the refinance after years of benefiting from the property. If they pull the file because of you, the consequences will sit with you. He texted the same threat 15 minutes later. That was a mistake. People like Sebastian trust spoken pressure because spoken pressure can later be reframed. Written pressure attaches itself to chronology. The next morning I wrote to Mara Ellison. I knew Mara because Lisa Merrick had referred me to her years earlier for a post-closing question on unrelated trust paperwork. Mara was not dramatic. She did not speak in movie lines. She spoke the way good litigators think, by narrowing the field of fantasy. When I sent her the refinance waiver, the executed prenup with Schedule C, Charles's email, the dinner threat text, and my preliminary contribution spreadsheet, she replied in under an hour. Do not sign anything. Do not accuse anyone of fraud by email. Preserve every version. Send me the lender packet, your signed prenup, proof of the missing page in the bank copy, and your top-line contribution categories. Also tell me whether the first refinance used your income or whether you merely discussed it. I sent everything I had. Mara called that afternoon. The page matters, she said. Not because it magically turns you into a co-owner, but because it proves the marriage was never meant to treat your contributions as invisible. The new waiver is drafted to eliminate arguments someone already knows may exist. Charles says the page was conceptual. Charles is being paid to say the page was conceptual. Do I have enough? I asked. You have enough not to sign. Whether you have enough for a strong reimbursement or equitable credit outcome depends on the paper trail and on how much of the appreciation connects to provable capital work and refinance dependence. I want cleaner proof on 3 points. 1. The page was part of the executed agreement, not an orphan draft. 2. Your money and marital money actually went into principal or permanent improvements in traceable ways. 3. The property's financing history used your earnings or your signature as a functional support. Do you have public records on permits and title? Permits, yes. Full title chain, not yet. I'm looping in North Star for public record verification only, she said. No games. County records, permit timing, recorded documents, any refinance traces available through public channels. We stay legal and boring. Legal and boring can save a life. That evening, while Mara drafted a preservation letter to Charles and a notice to the lender that I would not sign any spousal waiver pending independent review, I kept digging through old project files. The answer came from a place I had not expected. When we married, Lisa's office had sent a delivery memo with our final executed binder. I found the memo tucked into the same archival box as the prenup. It listed contents by page count. Prenuptial agreement with Schedules AC, 18 pages. That alone was useful, but not enough. Then I found the invoice packet from the copy center Lisa used back then. It showed reproduction of an 18-page executed agreement for client and opposing counsel sets. Still helpful. Still not conclusive on its own. The stronger proof came from the first refinance file. Buried in an old email folder under a bland subject line from the original banker was an attachment checklist. Required documents received, tax returns, insurance declarations, entity statement, executed prenuptial agreement with Schedule C, spouse income verification, occupancy affidavit. Executed prenuptial agreement with Schedule C. I read that line 3 times. The first refinance had closed using a file that explicitly recognized Schedule C. 4 years later, in the second refinance, the page had vanished. North Star's report arrived the next afternoon. Public records showed the timing of each major permit application tied to the capital projects I had logged. The roof permit matched my contractor draw dates. The drainage correction matched the engineering invoice. The kitchen structural permit and completion sign-off lined up with the months my bonus deposits went directly into project payments. North Star also pulled a title abstract confirming that while Briarwood remained titled solely to Sebastian, the original deed package referenced a later recorded mortgage modification during the first refinance period. Not a smoking gun, but a bridge. Mara took the bridge and built a road. She sent Charles a clean, ruthless letter. It did not scream misconduct. It stated that I possessed an executed 18-page prenuptial agreement including Schedule C, that the lender packet provided to me omitted the schedule while requesting waiver of rights directly addressed by that schedule, that I had substantial documentary evidence of capital contributions and refinance reliance, and that I would not execute any waiver or consent pending full production of all versions of the agreement furnished to the lender, the first and current refinance underwriting files, and a written explanation of any claim that my contributions had been previously satisfied, reimbursed, or waived. She sent a separate short notice to Alder Private Bank saying only that there was an unresolved dispute concerning spousal rights, contractual contribution provisions, and historical underwriting reliance, and that any assumption that I consented to waive such issues would be inaccurate. Within 24 hours the bank paused the closing. That was the moment Sebastian truly understood I might not disappear politely. He came home early for the first time in weeks and found me in the library with my invoices spread across one end of the long table. He did not shout. Sebastian never shouted when control still seemed recoverable. You brought in outside people, he said. You brought in Charles and a lender. You are creating a legal spectacle over a house that has always been mine. Over a file that says I funded none of it. He rested both hands on the back of a chair and leaned slightly toward me. Eleanor, listen carefully. If this transaction collapses, there are other obligations attached to the liquidity plan. That sounds like your problem. Our problem. No. If I sign that waiver, it becomes my problem. Right now it is still yours. His face changed then, only slightly, but enough for me to see the calculation behind the charm. What do you want? That is another sentence wealthy men use too early. They ask it before the facts are fully developed because they hope your price will reveal a limit smaller than what the record might eventually support. I said, I want the full first refinance file, the exact prenup copy Charles sent to the bank, and an accounting of every basis on which anyone has claimed my contributions were already satisfied. He stood up straight. That is not a wife speaking. I replied, then perhaps you should have treated the wife better while you still had one. Mara later told me that men like Sebastian often make the same tactical error at this stage. They assume the real dispute is emotional and that once the emotional temperature is lowered, the documents can be pushed back into abstraction. But documents become most dangerous precisely when emotion has burned off. Once I stopped asking whether Sebastian loved me and started asking which page count he had provided to which institution on which date, the whole marriage changed shape. 3 days later Charles responded. His letter was half retreat, half threat. He admitted that a version discrepancy may have occurred in assembling materials for the lender. He insisted there had been no intent to mislead and repeated that any Schedule C rights were limited, contingent, and subject to offset. Then he introduced a new theory. According to Charles, many of my expenditures had already been economically neutralized by support the Whitmore system had provided during the marriage. Enclosed was a family office ledger excerpt characterizing several categories of spending as internal household balancing entries and temporary support loans. Support loans. Mara called me as soon as she saw it. They are trying to relabel your money after the fact, she said. Do not panic. Do any of these supposed loans have promissory notes, repayment schedules, transfer confirmations into your personal account, or even a signed acknowledgement from you? They did not. What they had were internal accounting descriptions in a family office ledger no external institution had ever shown me. One line claimed a $60,000 household capital advance. In the same month I had wired the kitchen contractor from my own account. Another claimed a seasonal support adjustment in a quarter when my salary had covered most of the joint account activity because Sebastian had suspended his own transfers during a dispute over a development fund. The ledger was not evidence of reimbursement. It was evidence of storytelling. Mara asked for source documentation behind every so-called offset. That request cracked something open. A week after the bank pause, Charles produced a partial set of first refinance materials. It included the occupancy affidavit, Sebastian's financial statement, my employment verification, and the underwriter conditions summary. One condition note stated, obtain spouse documentation and fully executed marital property attachment before clear to close. Marital property attachment. Not just a spouse acknowledgement. An attachment. Then came the email that mattered most. It was an internal exchange from the old banker to Charles's office saying, we have Schedule C in the file now and can proceed with spouse-related review because her income support and capital contribution history have been clarified. Capital contribution history. I sat with that line and felt something inside me go cold and still. The first refinance had not simply tolerated my presence in the financial picture. It had specifically processed my contribution history. Which meant Sebastian and Charles had known for years that the marriage had left a paper trail around Briarwood that could not be erased by tone alone. Mara's response was merciless in the best way. She wrote that their own historical lender communications defeated any claim that my role had always been merely informal. She attached the executed Schedule C, the delivery memo, the old underwriting checklist, selected bank records, project invoices, and the permit chronology. She then proposed a practical choice. Either the refinance remained paused while we pursued full property review through separation counsel and lender process, or Sebastian negotiated a defined resolution of my contractual and equitable claims before any new transaction went forward. For the first time since this began, the pressure moved fully onto him. The hotel investment he wanted was time-sensitive. The private line he intended to pay down had renewal terms approaching. The rate lock on the refinance expired. Most importantly, his preferred image of himself as a man who quietly mastered every structure in the room no longer matched the record. His own paperwork had used my income to strengthen the house and my contributions to stabilize the narrative. He asked for a meeting without Vivian, without Charles, and without the staff moving in and out of Briarwood. We sat in the archive room where he had first placed the packet in front of me. On the table between us were the refinance waiver, the executed Schedule C, my contribution summary, and a draft settlement outline from Mara. Sebastian looked tired in a way I had not seen before. Not broken. Just stripped of the comforting assumption that the institutions around him would automatically collapse in his favor. If we resolve this, he said, I want it private. Private is easy, I said. Accurate is harder. He did not smile. We went through numbers. Appraised value, $4.82 million. Loan balance, just under $940,000. Traceable contributions set under my conservative methodology, $486,240. Added value tied to documented capital work, substantial but debated. Historical reliance on my income and signature in refinancing, undeniable. Potential litigation costs, lender complications, timing damage, and discovery exposure, unpleasant for everyone. Mara had warned me not to get hypnotized by abstract fairness. You are not being asked to win a philosophy seminar, she said. You are deciding what documented outcome protects your future. So I did not ask for half the house. I asked for what the record justified and what his urgency made realistic. The deal that emerged over the next 2 weeks gave me $1,740,000 in a combined cash settlement and secured payout schedule tied to a sale of certain liquid family market holdings, full release from any responsibility connected to Briarwood debt or future upkeep, confirmation that no document existed in which I had waived Schedule C rights before this dispute, and immediate separation terms that untangled our accounts, insurance, and residence. Sebastian would keep Briarwood, but the refinance as structured died. He could not close on the bank's timetable, and the Charleston hotel opportunity moved on without him. Vivian considered this a disgrace. Louisa called it extortion. Charles called it an efficient resolution reached without admission. Mara called it what it was, the price of trying to erase a paper trail with etiquette. The strangest part was that my victory did not feel triumphant in the loud way people imagine. There was no final courtroom speech. No confession in a doorway. There was just the slow, exact transfer of consequence back to the person who had tried to outsource it. I moved out before the settlement funds were fully completed because I could no longer sleep in a house where every repaired surface reminded me that I had once begged to be acknowledged for keeping it standing. I rented a furnished place for 3 months, then bought a smaller house in my own name on the edge of town. It had none of Briarwood's lineage and all of my peace. The roof was 5 years old. The heating system was modern. The kitchen did not require a structural engineer to boil water. When the closing papers arrived from my new house, I read every page anyway. Old habits can be a kind of prayer. A month after I moved, one final item came from Charles's office, an executed acknowledgement that the Whitmore side had received my copy of the prenuptial agreement and that the operative agreement included Schedule C as signed on the wedding date. It was probably drafted to limit future argument. To me, it read like reluctant truth. I printed it and placed it in a new archival box. Then I took the original executed prenup from the old wedding binder and turned slowly to page 18. The language looked smaller than I remembered. The page itself was plain. No gold border. No threatening stamp. No cinematic revelation. Just a modest attachment that said, in effect, if one spouse pours real money into a house she is never allowed to own, the record should remember. That was all I had wanted in the end. Not Briarwood. Not the Whitmore name. Not even revenge. I wanted the record to remember that I had been there in a way that cost me something. Sebastian spent years telling me the house was his because the trust came before me. But when he wanted $1.2 million out of those walls, the bank looked past his mythology and toward the same things I had quietly preserved: my pay stubs, my wires, my signatures, my permits, my invoices, my missing page. He believed the oldest power in the room was his family's name. It wasn't. The oldest power in the room was the written record. And the page they removed was the one that taught me not to leave without it.